Despite the passage of the Civil War amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th, unfortunately, positive change for African Americans was really still very slow to come historically. And this video just highlights some of the roadblocks, like the barriers to African Americans, sort of like their pursuit of better treatment, equality, following the Civil War and the abolishment of slavery. The first is that many Southern states established segregation. Um, what is known as de jure segregation is segregation that is like backed up by law. It's like enforced by law. It's like endorsed by like the government. And this was established initially by the Jim Crow laws that were passed in the South in like the 1800s, and they sort of lasted into the modern era. In one of the most controversial rulings ever in the history of the Supreme Court, in 1896, they essentially ruled in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal is okay, right? Thus, like legalizing segregation across the entire country. The idea that if you were going to keep things separate, that was okay as long as you made things equal. Well, we obviously know that it was much easier to make things separate and that there was little attempt to make that equal, right? And this video sort of like highlights the effect and the implementation of these segregated policies.
I was 10 when we moved to Birmingham, Alabama. My dad was sent there to build a church. When you move a lot as a child, you're the new family on the block. Our community was not well kept. There was litter on the streets. It was hot, and it takes a while to adjust to that. And then we had to get used to seeing all these signs. I began to see, well, wait a minute, what is this? What is this craziness? I rebelled. When we would get on the bus, they would have these little signs that you had to sit behind, colored and white, but you could move them. So I would move mine as far to the front as possible. You could go to an ice cream store. On one side, you had places to sit and eat your ice cream. On the other side, you had to either stand or buy it and leave. Of course, I went to the other side, and I was sent back. I just had to do that. I just felt like, you know what, this is wrong. Wherever I felt like I could take a sip from the white fountain, I would.
All right, so it just highlights a little bit about some of the segregation that existed. There are also methods to sort of discriminate against African American voters to really like limit the effectiveness of like that amendment, which was supposed to give the 15th everyone the right to vote regardless of their race, right? Again, white and African American males are supposed to be able to vote regardless of race because of the 15th Amendment. But Southern states essentially passed all sorts of like mechanisms that would prevent African Americans from voting. Some states required literacy tests, meaning that in order to register to vote, you'd have to pass like some sort of like test. Some were like historical tests, some were like logic based, some just required you to demonstrate the ability to read. Some states required poll taxes, meaning you had to pay in order to vote. Other states required what are called voting vouchers, which if you were a newly registered person, like you wanted to register to vote, you had to get somebody to vouch for you or endorse you that was already registered to vote. Well, like some areas, like there were no African American registered voters, so a newly registered African American, if somebody wants to register to vote, wouldn't be able to get anybody to vouch for them because you would have to get someone from the all white sort of like voting pool to be able to do that, and many areas weren't willing to do so. Literacy tests, poll taxes, and voting vouchers oftentimes, like the way they got around the 15th Amendment was that, whites and African Americans is applied to them. But the way that you sort of use this just to disqualify African Americans and not white voters is that you essentially would say, like, okay, you don't have to take the literacy test or pay the poll tax or use the voting voucher system if you could prove that your grandfather voted. And these were known as grandfather clauses. And obviously, very few African Americans were able to point or prove that their grandfathers had voted, but this was rather easy for white voters to do. So all of these sort of methods were used to discriminate against African American voters and limit the impact of the 15th Amendment.